Welcome back to the M&M podcast, and we have got a good one for you today. We are going to go through every album, every fight, all the drama of one of my favorite bands, Oasis. And I've got my sidekick today, Alex, who he likes Oasis, but definitely not a diehard fan like me. But he'll be along for a ride and give his 2 cents when he can, for sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a shot here because I enjoy the band Oasis. I've been a fan, but not as a super fan as Mitch. So he's gonna teach me a lot today, and yeah, I'll tell you what I can about it. I'm just gonna learn more like you guys today. That's it.
Alex is like a normal music fan who's familiar with the band, but isn't like one of his like handful of favorite bands where he knows every album, every song like I do. So
Mhm.
I'll be driving for this one, but it'll still be fun to go back and forth. Alex, you listened to some of their stuff leading up to the episode, so I'm sure it's fresh in your mind, a couple of the songs.
Yeah, I got a big rundown by Mitch. He's like, listen to these. I'm like, perfect. Okay,
I
got it.
only gave him about 50, so
About
he
50. Yeah.
might not have gotten to them all, but that's all right.
Falling asleep to the sounds of Oasis last night. I
Yeah,
was just putting it in, so it's good.
definitely. So we'll go through kind of the timeline, backstory, and touch on each album. Just give our thoughts. Give it. This is an episode for people who want to learn about Oasis and proper Oasis fans who just want to hear kind of our opinion and analysis on the band. But it all
Mhm.
started in terms of the backstory. There was a band of the guitarist Bonehead, Guigsy, Tony McCarroll, and then they ended up asking Liam to join the band, who was a singer, but not really a singer. He never sung anywhere professionally or had any lessons, anything like that. There's actually a story of when he was 16. He couldn't care less about music. He was like 16, 17, high school. Couldn't care less about music. And then one day, kids from like a rival school or whatever, they got into a big fight, and some guy hit him over the head with a hammer, and he like bled everywhere and had to go to the hospital and everything. And he said after that, all he wanted to do was listen to music. So he got into like the Beatles, the Doors, like any record he could get his hands on, and then just listen to that all day, every day.
Jeez.
And so it's probably like, who knows if that actually caused it, but that's a pretty interesting like turning point in terms of his career and like what a butterfly effect it had, obviously. And so they were a band, and they were called The Rain, and Liam was like, no,
The rain.
we're not, I'm not in a band called The Rain. So they ended up going with Oasis, and Noel was working as a roadie for Spiral Carpets,
Hmm?
this other band, and so he had a little bit of knowledge of the industry. But when he came back to Manchester, they knew they needed to get him because they knew he could write songs and play guitar. And he was like, yeah, sure. And then but he was also like perplexed that Liam was the singer, because he's like, you've never sung in your life. Like, because Noel would be playing his guitar all day, every day, right? Because he loved music ever since he was a
I
kid.
didn't know he could sing.
But Liam wasn't like that, right? He was more into
Hmm.
football and kind of thought music was for losers, sort of, like the
Wow.
guitar guy. But yeah, obviously it worked out, and they were cutting their teeth like in Manchester. And then eventually they got signed, and they released their first album, Definitely Maybe, which is the fastest. Let me keep in mind what I'm saying here.
Hmm.
The fastest selling debut album in UK history.
And to this day holds that record.
Faster than Elvis, faster than the Beatles, faster than Queen, you name it. They
Wow.
are the fastest selling debut album in UK history, which is it almost doesn't make sense because they weren't promoted like crazy. It was all word of mouth, them performing at different gigs around the country and just getting this reputation for themselves as kind of like bad boys and that, because their gigs oftentimes there'd be like fights and all different kind of stuff. But
And also, this is before like pre social media
oh yeah, way
too,
before.
right? So like this is a crazy how they get like that much attention and that much like that following without that. Just
Mm-hmm.
again, word of mouth, and that's crazy. So we'll talk about like the influence the music has and how that kind of like just blew up.
Yeah, and for that album, obviously, like the hits or like the singles were "Live Forever," "Supersonic," "Shaker Maker,"
Hmm.
which they're all fine. I think "Live Forever" is a good song. "Supersonic's" a good song. I don't care too much for "Shaker Maker," but
Hmm.
for me, I would say my favorite three songs from that album are actually "Cigarettes and Alcohol," "Rock and Roll Star," and "Slide Away." What would you say is your favorite or couple favorites from their debut album?
Mine, I'd say like "Live Forever" is one I heard a while ago. That was one of the first Oasis songs I heard, besides Wonderwall.
Yeah.
We'll get into the Morning Glory because that's the one that was how I was introduced to Oasis.
Hmm.
But "Live Forever," Cigarettes and Alcohol, and probably "Slide Away."
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
rock and roll is good too. Like those three I just listened to too. Those are
mhm.
great songs.
Yeah, those were some of the ones I recommended just for you to you'd already heard probably a couple of them, but
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
to just remind you. And yeah, I mean, I think it was an outstanding album. Like for a debut album, holy smokes, like it, and I know it took a while for them to find the right sound. Like they switched producers. At one point, Noel was like, screw it, let's just put it out and then get it right on the second album. And their guy from the record label was like, if you do that, you're not going to get a second album. You have to make sure you get it right because they couldn't replicate their live sound. And then they
Mhm.
brought in another guy, and then it was like, boom, like Rock and Roll Star. Like the intro to that is so good. It's
Mhm.
just like, it's a perfect rock song. It makes you want to be a like like a musician and like a rock star. And I just think it was like the perfect. It just reflected the attitude and the style of the band, that album, because especially when you look at some of their next album and albums down the line, it was brash, like it was bold and unapologetic, like it was cocky for some songs. But then they also have that tender side, right? Like "Live
Mhm.
Forever," and "Married with Children," like some other songs where maybe it's a bit sad or it's a little bit melancholic in a
Melancholic,
sense.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, see, there you go.
but
And that's exactly how I describe it.
mhm.
And that's why I see what like the difference between the first and second album. Because you said the first one was like fastest growing selling album of all time, right? In UK history.
Debut album, fastest.
Debut album, that's right.
Hmm.
And then you get to the second album, Morning
Hmm.
Glory, or What's the Story, Morning Glory, and
Hmm.
you see that album had more of those like calmer ballads, the kind of
Hmm.
like um melancholic ballads, I'd say, of the 90s. And
Yeah.
so I think is that what really like blew up on the first album? Because people like the tender side. And I was saying that's what people can relate to it more. You're saying there's a resurgence in teenage, like listening to it and
Yeah.
stuff. Is being
Yeah.
heard.
I think in the first album it was more the heavier. I think it was "Live Forever" was the like massive one.
Mhm.
But I think also the heavier stuff was really resonated too, because like
Mhm.
"Cigarettes and Alcohol" is such a I love that song because like
Mhm.
they wrote songs about themselves where like they were these unemployed guys in the UK where like all they cared about was like making music, listening to music, smoking weed, drinking, and smoking cigarettes. Like that's all they cared about,
Yeah.
right? So it's like even the intro to that song, it's like, is it my imagination or have I finally found something to live for? And then it's like talking about cigarettes and alcohol,
Yeah.
right? It's like it's such like it's a simple thing, but it's also like it's cool because I think it's relatable for people. Like maybe your job isn't going so well, friends, whatever, but like not that it's the healthiest habits, but that's what a lot of people do. Like they like to drink, they like to have a smoke and relax, and obviously to have like a kick-ass song with that sort of message was probably relatable for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's why it had, I guess, such a big following and a big resonation with people. Because like, yeah, they had that, cigarettes and alcohol and that kind of stuff, like kind of like I wouldn't say mainstream relatability, but just a lot
Mhm.
of yeah, I guess it's being relatable, but then that tender side is something they don't a lot of people didn't like sing about in like rock music as much,
They
you
had,
could
yeah,
say.
they
I
had
mean, they
it.
do talk about it. They talk about love and stuff using the 80s and stuff,
Hmm.
that kind of music. But in terms of like being vulnerable, that sound is like, I guess that's what made people even more relatable to it. Like,
Hmm. Well, and let's just like jump right in. Obviously, "What's the Story, Morning Glory" is one of the biggest albums of all time, one of the biggest and best albums of the 90s. um and it's a terrific album. Like there's no skips really. There's like the swamp songs which are weird, but they're just like interludes basically, like between songs.
Mhm.
But other than that, I don't there's no skips. And this is definitely a bit more like softer, I would say, than their first album, but I think the
Mhm.
songwriting is just as good if not better. And I think it's more universal because it's less punk. Not that their first album's a punk
Mhm.
album, but like some of those songs that we were talking about, as well as others, like they're a bit heavy. They do have like a little bit of an edge where
Mhm.
not everyone is gonna like that.
Yeah,
Whereas
like
this one is
Britpop
like,
punk, I'd say that's what it
yeah,
sounded like. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Whereas like this album, like who wouldn't like like Champagne Supernova or Don't Look Back in Anger. Like they're just great songs that could be played anywhere, right?
Those are my two
Anytime.
my favorite Oasis songs, I gotta say.
Yeah, and
Up
then
there.
the other big hit was obviously Wonderwall, which is like more controversial than those other two. But
Yeah.
for Wonderwall, here's my opinion on Wonderwall. I think it's a good song,
Mhm.
borderline really good song. Not great though. But obviously when it gets played that much, people just build a resentment to it. And the fact
Mhm.
it's so easy to play on guitar, so you have all these people who were forced to listen to it at parties and campfires and different things. That's kind of what made it so hated by a lot of people,
Oh, I
which
played it
is
before. Oh yeah.
oh yeah, I know you're the guy I'm
100%.
talking about. No, I'm kidding. Well,
It's
who
you.
knows? No,
You're
no,
the problem, Alex.
no. But you know what I mean though, right? Like people
Yeah,
are like,
yeah.
oh, get a load of this guy, like playing Wonderwall on his guitar and like so yeah, I think that's where the resentment comes from with that song. I think it's a good to above like quite good song, but not a great song, not one of their best songs, I wouldn't say.
Mhm.
Um, but just to go through, because there was a lot of drama kind of surrounding this album, as there always was with Oasis, there was always tension. But obviously, it was a tough act to follow after that first album was such a smash hit, but they blew it out of the water. And there was lineup changes between the two albums because Noel, who was quite the authoritarian in the band, he deemed the drummer and a founding member, Tony McCarroll, wasn't good enough and wouldn't be able to play the songs on this album when he was writing them. He's like, there's no chance our drummer's good enough to play these. So they
Mhm.
ended up going with Alan White. They recorded at Rockfield Studios, which was where Bohemian Rhapsody was
Mhm.
recorded. So kind of a historic, cool studio, obviously. There was a legendary fight that broke out in the studio and like the outside of the studio uh, towards the end of the completion of the album, and it ended with Noel smashing Liam's head in with a cricket bat. So just
Okay.
brotherly love, and that was pretty typical of Oasis. They would get into fights all the time, but overall, I think this album just established them as just one of the great bands of their generation, right? I like the 90s and pretty much 90s onward. Like to me, it's probably my favorite album. 1990 onward is probably this album is probably my favorite, and obviously Wonderwall became one of the biggest songs of all time.
Yeah.
And
And that
then
broke some records, I assume.
yeah, it's definitely up there. Like it has
As a
over a billion
single, yeah.
streams on Spotify. So I don't know exactly, but yeah, I mean that is the song that took them all over the world and made them just like a mainstay in pop culture forever, pretty much because of
Mhm.
that song, and
Yeah.
partly because of what I mentioned, like guys playing it at parties and that. And then they had Be Here Now,
Mhm.
which was highly anticipated, obviously, because you had those two massive first albums, particularly What's the Story of Morning Glory, and they were on top of the world. And when you're on top of the world, there's only one place to go, isn't there?
You can do
Right?
whatever you want, and
And
sometimes it's not the best thing to do.
that's down. It's basically like you either make another amazing album, become one of the greatest bands of all time, like undisputably,
Mhm.
or you have a disappointing album and then you kind of, some
You fall
people think
back in the
you're an
pack.
all-time great band, some people think you're a good band, whatever, you know what I mean? But
Mhm.
there's only a handful of bands that reach that level, like Zeppelin, Stone, like Beatles, whatever.
Mhm.
So it wasn't likely, but yeah, and I think the biggest thing, like the hits were all around the world. The singles "Stand by Me," "Do You Know What I Mean," "Don't Go Away," and I like all those songs. Actually, some of the singles I didn't care for, the ones they picked,
Mhm.
but I liked all those. My favorite is probably "Stand by Me." If I were to pick, what would you say is your favorite song from that album? "Be Here Now."
Well, the Do You Know What I Mean? That was a
Yeah.
great intro, like a great opening track, and I really
Mhm.
like that one. And it had like a little bit of like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounded like it had a little like beeping, like a Morse
Yeah,
code
it
thing
had
in the
like
intro. And
beeping. Well, that a whole album. If you listen to the entire album, you hear all these like different sounds and like there was helicopters like whirring in
yeah,
that
I
song
remember
as well.
Bennett, like we had here as a guest star a few episodes ago. Wow, yeah,
Mhm.
he mentioned that too about Oasis with like the sounds and stuff they did,
Yeah.
and that's a weird time to be experimental with some stuff when we're trying to like keep
Well,
going after like Morning Glory, you know?
yeah, I think it's a matter of kind of being lost in the sauce, if you will, where like
Yeah.
they couldn't put a foot wrong, so they're so arrogant and that. And I'm not like I don't blame them. I think it was a good album, but it was
Mhm.
disappointing after those first two and wasn't critically received well. Well, it was initially, but that was just because people didn't want to be wrong, because they were wrong about the second album being bad. So they wanted to be like,
Mm,
oh, this is amazing. And then like a few months later, they're like, actually, no, not really.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I think it's a matter of like when musicians first start out, they're able to relate to regular people, right? They write
mm,
songs about their lives, and that resonates with regular people. Versus like 4 or 5 years later, you are a multi millionaire who's traveled the world, gets everything he wants, never is told no, never has to struggle for anything really. Writing songs at that point is a lot harder for most people,
mm,
right? And then people don't relate to the songs as much. And I think you see that in that album a little bit. Um, but yeah, I think it was a good album, but it paled in comparison to the first two, is what
mm.
I would say.
Yeah,
And
too
then
comfortable. That's a good way of putting that, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's just yeah, and again, it's like a good album, but compared to the first two, it's like I'd probably give definitely maybe like 8.5, 9 out of 10, like really good album. What's the Story, Morning Glory, incredible album. Then this one was like like 6, 7 out of 10, like decent album.
It was enough to pay the bills, keep the name up.
Yeah,
You know,
I
it
mean, it
was
was still
good.
like I think it was their best selling album actually.
Oh, really?
At least like in its first week or two, right? Because of
Mhm,
all the anticipation. But yeah. Then they had the Master Plan, and that's an interesting album. We don't have to go through too much. It was mainly B-sides, so like tracks that had already been released, whether it be like EPs or B-sides of albums. I guess we weren't in the album era. I'm not that familiar with them, but basically like a good amount of the songs were available, but not a lot of people had them, right? Because it was like special edition EP with these 3 songs, and then the B side had a couple from that album. So they kind of compiled them all as well as a few original tracks and
mhm.
put them out.
So that came out like pretty fast then because they already had the stuff recorded. They just kind of cobbled it together and
They might have had to re-record some of it. I'm not sure, but yeah, I would imagine it was definitely much easier than like writing a brand new album and recording a new album for sure.
okay.
And that song, I think the only single was Acquiesce, which is a great song. That's a great song. And then what some of my favorites were Rock and Share, Half the World Away, Talk Tonight, and The Master Plan. And I
Mhm.
think this is their third best album, personally. I think this is their third best album. If you take the first two, whichever way you want to order it, I think this would be third.
Okay,
And
so what should I listen to then in that album? Because Acquiescence, I
yeah,
know of that song. So
mhm. Yeah, I mean the ones I mentioned, like Acquiesce, Rock and Share, Half the World Away, The Master Plan would be a few. Like if people
mm,
want to check out that album, definitely. And then there's more sort of turnover in this period as between that album and their next album, Bonehead and Guigsy both left the band. So the 3 original members, along with the brothers, those 3 are now gone in the band
really,
after Master Plan.
that's the plan.
And there was lots of different reasons, but definitely being in a band with Noel and Liam Gallagher would take a toll for
Yeah.
sure. And then they released Standing on the Shoulders of Giants.
Mm,
Not a great album. The singles were Go Let It Out, Where Did It All Go Wrong, Who Feels Love, Sunday
Who
Morning
feels loves?
Call. Again, decent album. Like I like Oasis, so I would still take like that album over a lot of other bands' good album, right? Like just because I'm a
Mm,
fan. But in terms of their like their expectations, not a very good album. The one I
mm,
do like for sure is like Roll It Over is a good song and it's cool. Liam still performs it now, but I don't really think there's much to touch on there. It's kind of just when they lost their way, I would say, in terms of like being a top-notch band producing great albums. It's like
mm.
that's the turning point after the Master Plan, in my
Like they
opinion.
just burned a little too bright, and then after that,
Yeah.
it was like they
And like
just
they still had some decent
mm,
songs, but in terms of like full albums after the Master Plan, it went downhill for sure.
mm,
Then they had Heathen Chemistry. This is a pretty good one. Decent one. The singles were The Hindu Times, weird title for a song. And like there's no reference to it. Like I don't, but it's a good song. Little
mm.
by Little, Songbird, which was written by Liam. I think that might have been his first song he wrote for the band because at least the first 4 albums were all written by Noel. Every song solo written by Noel,
Really,
which is
there wasn't any
crazy.
kind of collab work. He did all those hits by
All
himself.
those himself, all of them.
Wow,
Stop Crying Your Heart Out. That's one of their biggest songs ever, actually. Stop Crying Your Heart Out.
that's the one I've heard.
I
Yeah.
think that's
Mm,
third. But yeah, so I would say I just mentioned how they lost their way, but I would say this was like a decent rebound after Standing on the Shoulders of Giants,
mm,
that album. And then they had Don't Believe the Truth, a forgettable album, I would say, for the most part, other than like a couple songs. Like
mm,
Lila is good, and The Importance of Being Idle is a good song. I like that one, those two.
mm.
And then they had their last their last album, Dig Out Your Soul, which was neat because they had a totally different sound in this album than their previous work. So it's cool that they're kind of experimenting and it working, like coming up with new sounds, and it worked. And Liam wrote one of my favorite Oasis songs, which is "I'm Out of Time."
Mhm.
At this point, Noel wasn't writing all the songs; he just dried up creatively, I'm sure.
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
the
like,
time to be experimental, I guess. It's like
mhm,
your albums are on the down and out, and then you try a new sound, try it.
yeah, for sure. And then so they had that was their final album. They didn't know it at the time, but that was their final album. And then
Mhm.
there were always fights amongst the band, always conflicts between the brothers. There's like sibling rivalry, and pretty much everyone in the band hated Noel because Noel was just a jerk, pretty much. Like, great songwriter, great musician, but just, a
He's just
control
like
freak and like,
full of himself kind of thing, and
yeah. I mean, Liam
mm,
was too, but in a different way. Like, they described it in the documentary Supersonic. Like, Noel said, he's like, I'm a cat, Liam's a dog, and we just do not get along. It's like dogs are like, play with me, like, come on, let's go. Like,
yeah,
and cats are like, get the hell out of
yeah.
here. Like, you want to be alone, basically, right?
You
So
don't own a
yeah,
cat, a cat owns you.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're always fighting. And then the beginning and the end was April 2009, where Noel had a famous quote with Q magazine, where he said, in regards to Liam, he's the angriest man you'll ever meet. He's like a man with a fork in a world full of soup, which is a great quote. Like,
That's
it kind of shows like
a
why
good
he's a
line.
good
They should put
songwriter. Like, that's a great song. That's a great line.
yeah, I should put in this one.
And then August 2009, Oasis had to cancel a festival gig because Liam had laryngitis,
Ooh.
but Noel
Yeah.
said he was hungover, and
There you
that's
go.
why they couldn't perform. And so Liam sued him, or threatened to sue him,
Like
got in
a
the process of
defamation
suing
kind of
for
thing. Like I
defamation.
wasn't hungover.
Yeah, for defamation. And then it,
Jeez.
it eventually got resolved quickly after, like, went away after Noel apologized. And then, so less than a week after the laryngitis concert canceled, less than a week later, August 2009, at a gig in Paris, an argument broke out backstage. Liam was apparently, reportedly, wielding around Noel's guitar like an axe, and there was like a huge argument, fight, whatever. And eventually, like an hour later or so, Noel released a statement that he was quitting the band. And Noel was like the songwriter and the leader of the band, and I think he had a lot of control over it. So once he quit, that was it for Oasis. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't like they could continue. Although Liam did make a band after with the other members of the band, I believe.
They renamed and everything?
Yeah,
And
like BDI they were called, which it didn't
mm,
have much success. But yeah, so they broke up in 2009, that night in Paris, and the brothers have not spoken since. So
wow. I
it's
didn't know
not
they were not
amicable.
on talking terms whatsoever.
No, and I think they weren't even really talking much when they were in a band the last few years. Like, there were reports that they would travel separately. Like, it would be the band, and then Noel would
Mm.
travel on his own. Like, he just couldn't
Oh,
stand the other people. Couldn't stand being with Liam. So
jeez.
it's sad, like, brothers and that, but they always had conflicts even when they were kids. It's not like you had brothers who were like best friends who
Mm.
then grew to hate each other. It's like they always kind of, didn't get along. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or anything, and I don't know their relationship closely, so there's no point speculating. But yeah, it's too bad, and there's lots of calls for them to obviously get back together. There's a lot of money out there. I think it will happen
Mm.
because they're both starting to play the media game.
I saw
And it.
some. I was sorry to interrupt. I was looking up and
Mhm.
I saw some people say Oasis reunion, blah blah. I don't know
Mhm.
if it's just fans speculating or trying to drum it
Yeah.
up, but
There's definitely been some talk of that. Like, it used to be Liam always saying it. Noel would never even entertain it. Now Noel's the one saying it, and Liam's kind of like,
mm,
because, and it's one of those things where it's like two sides of the coin, right? Where,
mm,
like, if you only heard the one guy's perspective, you'd be like, yeah, like, he's right. But then if you heard the other one, you'd be like, oh, he's also right. Like, you know what I
yeah,
mean? It's complicated. But bottom line, they just need to grow up, talk to their manager. And you wish they could just actually get together as family, but
yeah.
that ship appears to have sailed. So
Mm.
the best you could maybe get is them on stage together, getting that connection musically, and singing harmonies, like that sort of thing, right?
Mm.
So, and
Yeah, and
obviously for
so
the fans.
and the fans, and that's what I want to touch on is like I want to ask you. You said there's more of a resurgence in Oasis and like listening to them
Hmm.
with like more teenagers and people in the early 20s like us kind of thing. And
Yeah.
why do you think that is? You think it's just because the timeless sound and people are now discovering it? They're kind of finding an alternative to the modern pop crap that keeps being churned out. Like,
I do think there is a lot of people who are looking back to older music, which has always happened, by the way. Like throughout history, there's always been people who go back a decade or two to listen to music.
mm,
But yeah, I think part of it is like the timelessness of their music. It's not that they're the Beatles by any means, and they get compared to,
mm,
like, people complain that they're really similar to the Beatles. They like ripped off the Beatles. I'm not a music expert, but I don't really hear it. There's definitely references to the Beatles,
mm.
but I don't know. I don't quite hear it, but a lot of people are like, they just try to rip off the Beatles or the,
Yeah,
whatever, like
I
that
wouldn't
kind of
say
stuff.
rip off. I'd say like
Yeah.
they grew up in the
Yeah.
UK. They've
Hmm.
listened to the Beatles their whole lives. Like they're going to
Hmm.
have some kind of imprint on them, but I wouldn't say rip off. Like no, I'd
Yeah.
say they had their own sound for
Yeah.
sure.
That's what I think. But yeah, that's definitely cool. But yeah, in terms of like why they've had a resurgence, I think part of it is young people going back and listening to other music. And I think there's just a universality to their music where it's kind of simple. Like the lyrics aren't like the most groundbreaking things ever or the most
Mm,
like moving things ever, but I just think they're relatable. They're about things like the Beatles would write about. Like they're about
yeah.
love. There's songs where they talk about kind of just struggling financially or struggling to find a job, like stuff young people can relate to, right? Like universal things that
Mm,
everyone goes through. And also I think they're a melodic band. Like they're not
mm,
they're not like the Doors or a band where like the music is what drives it or the lyrics is what drives it. They're a melodic band. And some people, they don't respect bands like that as much, but
mm.
that's what pleases people. Melody, harmony, stuff like that, like the simple tenets of music is what a lot of people enjoy. So I think it's the combination of the message of the songs as well as just, catchy tunes, great tunes and great
Yeah.
melodies, right? Timeless
Yeah.
melodies.
And the authenticity behind those meanings because
Hmm.
you know where they came from and everything. And you hear is I also hear in some of their songs a kind of, this is probably a bad way of putting it, but like a sing-songy cadence to some of their stuff,
Hmm.
and that's what makes it catchy,
Hmm.
right? It makes it catchy and paired with those melodies, like you're saying, because like new stuff, you'll have sing-songy stuff, but it seems hollow. Whereas this
Hmm.
is like there's a little weight behind it, you know?
Yeah, and I think like
So,
Liam's voice, you either love it or hate it because he has a
mm,
really strong, powerful voice, and it's quite like nasally. And the way he sings is unique because he has no formal training. He has no idea how to sing. He does now, obviously. But those first
mm,
couple albums, he had no idea how to sing other than just like his God-given ability, basically, and listening
mm.
to music, which maybe makes it better because it wasn't as polished, right? So
Raw talent.
everything all mixes together in the end. But yeah, I think that was a good summary. And then I was gonna quickly give a ranking to each album since we just went through them all.
Yeah, for
Because
sure.
I've
Go
listened to
ahead.
them all extensively. Because again, they're one of my favorite bands, and I listened to them religiously for a
Mm,
while. So at number 8, I would go "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants." I think that's just kind of a forgettable album. Couple decent songs, but again, for their expectations, which is how you have to rank it,
mm,
it wasn't very good. Don't Believe the Truth, again, this just forgettable album. A couple decent songs, but I would never buy the album. I would, you know what I mean? Like it's just like, whatever, kind of like a filler album, if you will, within their
mm,
discography. And then Dig Out Your Soul was a decent album. They have a different kind of sound to it. Amount of Time is one of my favorite Oasis songs. So that's like, I would say that's in a different tier than those bottom two. In terms of like decent album, not great, but decent.
mm.
Heathen Chemistry, there's a few great songs on that one. That was a solid album. It had one of their biggest hits, obviously. Stop Crying Your Heart Out, as well as a few other great tracks. And then Be Here Now, which was the third album. It's a bit controversial. Some fans love it. Some fans really don't care
Mm.
for it. I think it's a good album. It's a fun
It's a
album.
decent album, yeah.
I think look now that we're removed from it, where there wasn't the hype, it's more enjoyable. Whereas if you're in the moment and you have these two albums where they're just soaring up,
Mm.
then you're like, oh my gosh, third album, like this is gonna be amazing. And then it's like, what is this 9-minute song of like random sounds jumbled together? You know what I mean? Like stuff like that. That would have been a bit disappointing. But good album. So I have that fourth. And then top three, number 3, I have The Master Plan. I think that's, to me, that's the clear three, in my opinion. And people of a certain age maybe not feel that way because they were around when it came out. Because again, a lot of them were B-sides, so they might have already
Mhm.
heard the songs or had the songs on like cassettes or CDs or albums or whatever.
Mhm.
But for someone who's just removed from that, who's just been able to listen to it all immediately, where I didn't know the songs, I would put The Master Plan third. And then
Nice,
this is where
nice.
it's contentious. It's very close. But I have What's the Story, Morning Glory, number 1, definitely maybe number 2, but they're both great albums, different tones to the albums, different styles, but both fantastic. So I said What's the Story, Morning Glory is my favorite album. Now we got to hear from you, Alex. What is your favorite Oasis album?
I agree. What's the Story, Morning Glory? I'm not gonna fight
Yeah.
you on that one because I totally agree. Like that was the introduction to Oasis for me,
Hmm.
right? And like I always have a very special memory of Champagne Supernova because it's
Hmm.
kind of funny. I grew up loving that song, and every time I'm with my brother, my friends, and we're golfing, we will actually finish on the 18th hole. And we have a little speaker we play throughout the whole golf course. We keep it quiet, we're respectful. But when we finish the 18 hole, hat off, we play Champagne Supernova, shake the hands, and just walk back to the cart. We always play Champagne Supernova at the end. It's awesome. So
Very nice, very nice.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a great track, but
Mhm.
but yeah, I mean, we went through it all. I mean, I don't know what we're gonna call the episode yet, but I was thinking Oasis A to Z, something like that, because we pretty much covered it all. They're one of my favorite bands, so
Oasis,
I
looking
was,
back,
yeah,
not in anger. Don't look back in
maybe.
anger.
Oh, I would, yeah. There you go.
Or Noel, don't look back in anger.
Yeah,
Something like that.
that could be something. But yeah, we'll talk about it after the episode. But yeah, it was a good one. I was happy to be able to go through one of my favorite bands, do a little bit of a deep dive and kind of drive the episode today, but it was a great discussion.
Yeah.
And also in terms of band fights, which Oasis were known for, how was Capital Behavior in terms of band fights in that department?
Man, John was something else, man. I'm telling you,
John
Full
John is his
disclosure.
brother, the bassist, for
John's
people
my
that
twin
don't know.
brother, the bass
Yeah,
player. But
yeah.
no, honestly, like the only things we had like some issues with the beginning was
Mhm.
our singer showed up late to some band practices. Sometimes he didn't show up at all, you forget and sleep in. Happened a few times, and there were
Yeah,
some talks where we're like, dude, this isn't good, man. Like, what are we gonna do
yeah.
about him? So
Well,
not to put him on blast.
that's what happens with the lead singers, but no one was hitting anyone in the head with a cricket bat, were they?
No, I don't think it came to blows. I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Bennett would
yeah.
get up sometimes and do, just give us one. No, he was good about it. I'd say just we didn't really have that like we weren't fueled like that. I guess that's why
Yeah.
we're not a band that right now. We
That's
didn't
why you
make
guys
it.
didn't
So
make it. You didn't
we
have
didn't
the
make it.
fire. But
We didn't have the
that
fire.
that is way more than enough talk of Capital Behavior. I apologize to the viewers. No, I'm
No, no,
just
no.
kidding. They
Go
probably
check us out on YouTube. Go
they
check
love
out
that song.
our.
Check it out. Check it out. But yeah. Yeah, guys, if you enjoyed the show, subscribe, like, comment, let us know which episodes you want us to do next. And reach out to us on our social medias at Podcast M&M on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter.